There is a cover-up at the heart of Warhammer 40,000, and it is not the one you think. Yes, inside the fiction, the Imperium erased two of its Primarchs. The Second and the 11th struck their names from every record under the Edict of Obliteration. But here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The people who erased them are not the High Lords of Terra. They are the writers and designers at Games Workshop, and they have been doing it on purpose, in the real world, for more than 30 years. Go back to the earliest lore, the old Realm of Chaos books from the late 1980s, and the Primarchs were already a deliberately incomplete set. Over the decades, as the Horus Heresy was expanded into hundreds of novels, naming every traitor and every loyalist in agonizing detail, 2 slots were left conspicuously, permanently blank. And in interviews, the writers have admitted it is intentional, that the gap exists precisely so it can never be filled, never be retconned, never be resolved. The Imperium says 9 Primarchs, not 20. Games Workshop says 18, not 20. And both of them are guarding the same 2 empty chairs, for the same reason. A mystery you can never solve is worth more than any answer. Count them. We've done this before on this channel, and we'll do it one more time because the counting is the whole ritual. The Lion, Fulgrim, Perturabo, Jagatai Khan, Leman Russ, Rogel Dorn, Conrad Kurz, Sanguinius, Ferrus Manus, Angron, Robute Gilliman, Mortarion, Magnus, Horus, Lorgar, Vulcan, Corax, Alfarius. 18 names, 18 sons, and the Emperor made 20. At the 2nd and at the 11th, the record gives you a number with nothing attached to it, a gap the exact shape of a sun. Now, every other video in this series, every one, has stood inside the fiction and asked the in-universe question: who were they? What did they do? Where did the bodies go? This one does something different. This one steps outside the page entirely, because the gap you've been staring at for years is not just a hole in the Imperium's archive. It is a hole that real people, with real names, working at a real company in Nottingham, England, decided to leave there, and then guarded, for decades. The pronunciation note before we go any further, for the hobbyists who correct me in the comments and keep me honest, it is Primarch, not Primarch. It is the Edict of Obliteration, and its Realm of Chaos, the 2 gray hardback tomes from 1988 and 1990 where this whole thing starts. Get those 3 locked because they're load-bearing for everything that follows. So let's name the 2 layers cleanly because the entire video lives in the space between them. Layer 1 is the in-universe cover-up. Inside the story, the Imperium of Man condemned 2 of its legions to something the lore calls an Edict of Obliteration, also rendered in High Gothic as Damnatio Memoriae, condemnation of memory. It is declared by the High Lords of Terra. It is carried out by the Inquisition, and according to the lore's own framing, the erasure of the 2nd and the 11th is described as the most successful Edict of Obliteration ever carried out in Imperial history. Their names deleted from every record, an oath sworn by the surviving Primarchs never to speak the 2 absent names aloud. That is the cover-up the audience knows. That is the cover-up that launched 1,000 theories. But there is a second layer underneath it, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Layer 2 is the real-world cover-up. The Edict of Obliteration is not something that happened to the Imperium. It is something that was written. A person sat down and decided that 2 of the 20 would be left as a void. And then, across more than 3 decades, a whole company decided, repeatedly, deliberately, with documented commentary, to keep that void exactly as empty as the day it was made. The fiction censors and the setting's authors are, it turns out, doing the same job. The Imperium erases the 2nd and 11th to protect its myth. Games Workshop withholds them to protect the mystery. And the two cover-ups mirror each other so precisely that the in-universe Edict of Obliteration starts to look like what it has secretly been all along, the in-fiction name for a real-world editorial decision. Hold that thought. We're going to earn it, piece by piece, with the actual publishing record. Here is where the canon breaks open, and it breaks in the real world, not the fictional one. To understand why the blank is intentional, you have to understand where it came from. And it came from the very beginning.
Start in 1987 with the original Warhammer 40,000 rulebook, Rogue Traitor. And here's the first thing that surprises people. The Horus Heresy, the event that gives us the Primarchs and the Legions in the first place, was barely in it. The setting was a sci-fi sandbox stitched together from Dune and Moorcock and 2000 AD and Lovecraft. And it wasn't yet bothered with the deep internal history we now treat as scripture. The heresy as a coherent narrative, the betrayal, the brothers, the 20 legions, that crystallized a little later, in 1988, in a gray hardback book called Realm of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness. Its companion, The Lost and the Damned, followed in 1990. These two volumes are where the modern shape of the mythology is first set down with any coherence. And from that formative era onward, the structure carries a gap. The set was never presented as a tidy, complete 20 you could fully account for. It came preloaded with shadows. And there's a real-world inspiration sitting underneath the whole idea, which is worth a beat, because it tells you the blank was never meant to be a puzzle with a solution. Priestley has said, recalling his own thinking on a podcast years later, that the Space Marine legions were modeled on the Roman legions, and specifically on the way some Roman legions were lost, disgraced, or erased from memory. That's the texture he was after. Ancient Rome raised numbered legions, and some of those numbers drop out of the surviving record without a clean explanation, leaving historians to argue for centuries over what became of them. That ambiguity, that permanent unresolved silence, is exactly what Priestley wanted to import. He wasn't writing a mystery novel where the detective reveals the culprit in the last chapter. He was reaching for the feel of real ancient history, where some questions genuinely have no surviving answer and never will. The 2nd and the 11th are 40K's lost legions in the truest Roman sense, a deliberate echo of a real silence. And you don't solve a silence. You sit inside it and feel its weight. That was the assignment from the very first draft. I'll flag that the did something bad, then redeemed, then erased as mercy detail comes from Priestley's later recollection, given long after the fact, and shouldn't be treated as locked canon. But the Roman silence inspiration is consistent across how he's described it. Now, I want to be honest with you here, because this channel does not do the thing the rest of the niche does where every fuzzy claim gets stated as hard fact. The exact moment the 2nd and 11th became formally numbered but blank is genuinely contested. Some of the precision people throw around, the idea that one specific edition, on one specific date, created the void, does not survive contact with the actual record. What the record does support, clearly and repeatedly, is this. The gap is old. It is near the beginning, and it was preserved rather than closed. So I'm going to give you the strongest available account of how it happened, and I'm going to flag the parts where the sources disagree every time, so you always know which is which. That honesty is the point. The whole video is about a blank that's powerful precisely because it has no settled answer. it would be absurd to then lie to you about the timeline. The man who made the blank has a name, and he told us, in his own words, why he did it. Rick Priestley, co-creator of Warhammer 40,000, the person who originated the concept of the Lost Primarchs, was asked years later why he left 2 of the legions empty. And his answer is the single most important quote in this entire video.
He said, and I'm quoting him directly, "I left them blank because I wanted to give the story some kind of deep background, unknowable, 10,000-year-old mysteries, stuff that begs questions for which there could be no answer." Read that again, slowly. He did not say the records were lost. He did not say he ran out of room or that he meant to come back and fill them later. He said he wanted questions for which there could be no answer. The emptiness was the feature. The blank was the design. The 2nd and the 11th were never sons he forgot to write. They were doors he built specifically so they could never be opened. And this is where it gets stranger, because Priestley said something else in the same breath, and it complicates the clean story in a way that actually makes the case stronger. He added, "Mind you, all that got ruined when some bright spark decided to use the heresy setting, which rather spoiled the unknowable side of things." Sit with that.
The man who built the blank is, decades later, half grumbling that the company turned his unknowable distant myth into a fully novelized, exhaustively documented saga, and in doing so, threatened the one thing he wanted to protect: the mystery. So here's the tension that drives the whole back half of this video. Priestley wanted a void. Then, Games Workshop spent 30 years building the most documented fictional history in the hobby, right up to the edges of that void. And the void survived anyway. Which raises the obvious question, the one the audience keeps asking. If they documented everything else, why not these 2? You don't leave a gap by accident in a setting this obsessively cataloged. You leave it on purpose. And then you have to keep choosing to leave it, over and over, every time the temptation to fill it returns. So let's talk about that temptation, because the scale of it is the proof. Think about what Black Library has done since the late 2000s. The Horus Heresy novel series alone runs to more than 50 books. 50. And that's before you count the Primarchs novels, the Siege of Terra finale, the audio dramas, the short story collections. Every loyalist legion got its origin, its homeworld, its Primarch psychology mapped out chapter by chapter. Every traitor got a motive, a fall, a face. Dan Abnett, Graham McNeil, Aaron Dembski-Bowden, James Swallow, a whole stable of authors spent 15 years naming things, naming everything. In a setting documented to that absurd, magnificent depth, ask yourself honestly, what is the probability that 2 of the 20 legions remained blank because nobody got around to them? 0. That's the probability. Anything Games Workshop wanted to fill, it filled. It filled the gene seed quirks of obscure successor chapters. It filled the heraldry of squads that appear in a single scene. The idea that the 2nd and 11th are empty due to neglect in that environment is not credible. 2 permanently empty slots in the most exhaustively cataloged fiction in the hobby can only be a choice. The emptiness had to be defended against the company's own documenting instinct, and it was. And notice how the rest of the catalog actually behaves around the gap, because the contrast is almost comical when you line it up. The traitor Primarchs, the ones who genuinely betrayed the Emperor, the ones who broke the galaxy in half, those names are kept. Horus is named, Mortarion, Magnus, Fulgrim, Angron, Lorgar, Perturabo, Alfarius, Conrad Kurz. Every single rebel who turned on humanity at its highest hour stays fully on the record, named in the codices, novelized in loving detail, given motive and psychology and a face. The Imperium hates them, but it remembers them. The lore is explicit that you cannot simply unremember the arch-traitor of all human history. And yet 2 legions that, as far as we can tell, never fought in the heresy at all. 2 legions whose sin, whatever it was, the modern lore frames as a failure rather than a treason. Those 2 get the total deletion. The worst men in the story are remembered. The 2 we know least about are gone. That asymmetry is not how a forgotten loose end behaves. It is how a guarded secret behaves. The very fact that the genocidal traitors stayed on the page while the lost 2 were scrubbed tells you the scrubbing was special, deliberate, and protected. There is a moment in the publishing history that proves the defending happened, and almost nobody talks about it. Here's what the record shows. When the Lost Legions were first properly codified in the Index Astartes material, the Space Marine background series that ran in White Dwarf magazine in the early 2000s, the framing was different from what you know today. Originally, the 2 legions were presented as having been obliterated for terrible crimes committed during the Horus Heresy itself. That was the first draft of the blank. But then, in a documented design decision, author meetings where the team worked through the continuity, Games Workshop noticed a problem. It made no sense for 2 legions to be redacted from history for their crimes while Horus, the arch-traitor, and all the other rebels stayed fully on the record, named and remembered and hated. The math didn't work, so they changed it. They retconned the 2nd and 11th to having been disbanded and expunged before the heresy ever began. Now think about what that retcon actually does, because it is the hinge of this entire argument. They did not retcon the blank in order to fill it. They retconned it to protect it. They moved the erasure earlier in the timeline precisely so it would stay clean, so it wouldn't get tangled up in the heresy's fully documented events and forced into an answer. The change wasn't a step toward a reveal. It was a step away from one. And that tells you everything about how Games Workshop treats these 2. The blank is not a loose end they keep meaning to tie off. It is an asset they actively maintain. When the continuity threatened to back them into a corner where the gap might have to be explained, they rewrote the surrounding history to keep the gap unexplainable. That is not neglect. That is curation. They are gardeners, and the void is the thing they tend. And the books that came after kept tending it. Horus Heresy, Collected Visions. The big art and background omnibus with text by Alan Merritt, published in June of 2007, gathered the entire visual mythology of the heresy into one place, the iconic images of the Imperium and the betrayal, 4 volumes worth. And it left the 2 blank. Then came the novels, and the most striking example sits inside one of the best of them. In 2010, Aaron Dembski Bowden published The First Heretic, the 14th Horus Heresy novel. There is a scene where the word-bearer Captain Argel Tal is shown a vision by a demon, the birth of the Primarchs in the Emperor's gene vault, the gestation pods where the 20 were made. He moves through them. He sees the pod of the 11th. And here is the discipline of it. Even in that vision, at the very source, standing in front of the place where the lost son was made, the novel names nothing. It shows you the shape of the absence and refuses to fill it. That is an author with the perfect opportunity to drop a hint, a name, a face, and deliberately declining. Because the rule was already in place above him. The blank stays blank. And the writers will tell you the blank stays blank, in their own voices, on the record. This is the rare case where you don't have to infer authorial intent, because the authors have stated it outright. We already heard Priestley, questions for which there could be no answer. Now hear his successor. In 2018, a fan put a theory to Aaron Dembski-Bowden. The idea, floated in some books, that the Space Wolves were the ones who wiped out the Lost Legions. And Dembski-Bowden shut it down, not by arguing the lore but by explaining the policy. He said that couldn't be the explanation because, his words, that would be an answer, and there's not allowed to be an answer. Let that land. Not, we haven't decided yet. Not, maybe someday. There's not allowed to be an answer. That is a working Black Library author, the man who wrote some of the most beloved heresy fiction in print, telling you directly that the absence is protected by rule. The Second and the 11th are not an unsolved case file waiting for the right author.
They are a locked room that the company has decided, as a matter of policy, will never be opened. Because the lock is worth more than whatever's inside. I have to flag the honest caveat here, the same as before, because it matters. The deliberate blank reading, that one is solid. It is supported by the structure of the fiction and by the designer's own commentary, on the record, across 2 generations of the company. That part is as well established as anything about the lost Primarchs gets. What is not gospel is the precise motivation behind every individual decision and the exact dates of every shift. Priestley's later recollection of what the Lost Legions supposedly did, that they committed some terrible act, were redeemed by the Emperor, and were erased as an act of mercy. That's one account, given years after the fact, and it doesn't fully square with how the modern lore frames them. The modern framing is gentler and stranger. In Guy Haley's 2021 novel, Dark Imperium, Robute Gilliman thinks of the 2 lost brothers not as traitors but as having failed, and the surviving Primarchs are written remembering them with grief, not the righteous hatred they reserve for Horus and the other rebels. So which is it? Were they monsters erased in mercy, or were they tragic failures mourned in silence? The honest answer is that the record won't tell you, and that the refusal is the point. Accounts diverge. The story is deliberately built so they can keep diverging forever. Which brings us to the heart of it. Why a blank beats an answer. This is the creative logic, and once you understand it, you understand the whole machine, including the machine you're sitting inside right now, watching this. An answer is a finite thing. The moment Games Workshop tells you the second Primarch was named such and did this specific deed and met this specific end, the question is dead. There is nothing left to ask.
And worse than dead, it can disappoint. Whatever name they pick, whatever fate they assign, it will be smaller than the one you imagined. Because the one you imagined was assembled from your own fears and your own favorite corners of the lore, fitted perfectly to your own taste. No author can beat the version you built in your own head. So the moment they answer, they lose. They trade an infinite, perfectly personalized mystery for one fixed, finite, inevitably deflating fact. We have actually watched this happen in real time with other mysteries in this same setting, and the watching is instructive. Think about every long-running 40K question that eventually got a hard answer. The moment the company commits to a specific resolution, the conversation around it collapses. People stop theorizing and start either accepting it or arguing it was a bad call. And within a year, the energy is gone. The mystery becomes a fact, and facts don't generate. They just sit there.
Games Workshop has surely noticed this pattern across decades of running the most theory-driven fiction in the hobby. They have seen what happens to a question when you answer it, and they have a living counterexample sitting right in their own back catalog, 2 slots wide,
that has been generating discussion non-stop for over 30 years, precisely because they never touched it. If you ran that company and you watched 2 empty boxes outperform every answered question you ever shipped, what would you do? You would leave the boxes empty. You would protect them with your life. The blank is not a gap in the product. The blank is the most reliable product they have. A blank does the opposite of an answer. A blank generates. It is the most productive object in the entire setting precisely because it produces nothing of its own and demands that you produce instead. Think about the sheer volume of engagement those 2 empty chairs have created. Think about this very channel.
Think about the cohort of videos this one belongs to. The theories about null genes and pariah bloodlines, the Carcharodons as the hidden second, the Calexis Temple as the home of the 11th, every name reveal thumbnail you've ever clicked. The record-counting instinct that drives all of it, the same instinct a viewer named in the comments under this channel's most watched video, when he wrote, "Imperial records say 9 Primarchs, not 20. That counting, that itch to reconcile the number, that refusal to let the gap sit, that is the blank doing its job. It was built to be counted. It was built to be argued about. Every theory is fuel, and the gap feeds on it forever and is never satisfied. An answer would put the fire out. The blank keeps it lit."
And a company that understands its own audience. A company watching fan channels rack up 60, 70,000 views on videos that are, at bottom, about the fact that 2 boxes on a chart are empty. That company has every commercial and creative reason on earth never, ever to fill them. So now we arrive at the mirror, and this is the part that should make the hair on your arms stand up a little. Look at the 2 cover-ups side by side. Inside the fiction, the Imperium of Man erases the 2nd and the 11th because the truth about them is too dangerous to its own myth. The Imperium runs on the lie that the Emperor's design was perfect, that the Great Crusade was a clean and glorious thing, and 2 sons who somehow broke that story badly enough to require total deletion cannot be allowed to exist in memory. So the censors of Terra reach into the archive and cut. Outside the fiction, Games Workshop withholds the 2nd and the 11th because the truth about them, any truth, any answer at all, is too dangerous to the mystery's power. The setting runs on the engagement the blank generates, the endless theorizing, the bottomless content, the sense of unplumbed depth. And 2 answers that close the question off would be the worst possible thing you can do to a mystery that profitable. So the authors of Nottingham reach into the manuscript and decline to write. And look at the methods, because they rhyme too. Inside the fiction, the erasure is not partial. The Edict of Obliteration is described as total, names struck from every record, an oath sworn by the surviving brothers never to speak them, the most complete act of its kind in Imperial history. It is a deliberate, maintained, institution-wide silence. Now look at how Games Workshop handles it in the real world. It is not partial either. There is no half answer. No quiet hint dropped in a limited edition supplement. No, for the lore hounds, here's a clue. When the company's own continuity threatened to force a partial answer, when the early Index Astartes framing risked tangling the Lost Two into the documented heresy, they didn't compromise. They rewrote the surrounding history to keep the silence total. The in-fiction Inquisition and the real-world editorial team both treat the secret the same way, all the way down, or not at all. A partial erasure is a vulnerability. Both sets of Guardians know it, so both go for completeness. That is not a coincidence of theme. That is the author's method showing through the character's method, like a watermark held up to the light. Same gap, same protective instinct, same refusal for structurally identical reasons. The Imperium guards the void to protect its god. Games Workshop guards the void to protect the mystery. And that is why the Edict of Obliteration is such a perfect piece of writing, because it is the in-universe name for the real-world decision. When the lore says the High Lords of Terra condemned two names to be unspoken forever, what it is really describing, one layer down, is a creative team agreeing that two slots will be left unwritten forever. The fiction censors and the setting's authors are not just similar. They are the same act, viewed from two sides of the page. The Edict of Obliteration is Games Workshop describing its own editorial policy back to you in the costume of the story. The cover-up is real on both sides. That's the eerie part. You thought you were reading about the Imperium hiding something. You were also reading a company tell you, in code, exactly what it was doing to you and why. And so we come to the empty chairs, and to the reframing that makes every theory you've ever heard, including every one on this channel, mean something different than you thought.
Here is the uncomfortable, beautiful truth. Every single theory about the lost Primarchs is an attempt to fill a space that was built, with great care, specifically so it could never be filled. Every video, every forum thread, every name reveal, every elaborate reconstruction of who the second secretly was. All of it is people walking up to a door that was designed without a room behind it, and insisting there must be a room, and describing it in loving detail. And here's the thing. That does not make the theories pointless. It makes them the point. The second and the 11th were designed to be argued about. The arguing is not a failure to reach the answer. The arguing is the function the blank was created to perform. The theories are the monument. They are what the empty chairs were for. And I want to be careful here. The same way I've been careful all the way through. Because this channel has its own theories. The null gene reading, the pariah bloodline, the idea that pieces of the Lost Two are hidden in plain sight across the modern factions. I stand by those as readings. They're good readings. But I am not going to stand here and tell you any one of them, mine included, is the answer. Because the entire argument of this video is that there is no answer to be had, by design. To pretend otherwise would be to do the one thing the lore was built to make impossible, and to do it while claiming to have understood why it's impossible. So treat every theory you hear, on this channel and every other, the way you'd treat a cathedral built over an empty crypt. The crypt being empty doesn't make the cathedral a lie. It makes the cathedral the whole point. The builders knew the crypt was empty. They built anyway, and the building is the achievement. When you understand that, you stop asking the wrong question. You stop asking, who were they really? As if there's a sealed envelope somewhere in Nottingham with the real answer inside, waiting for the day the company finally relents. There is no envelope. That's the secret. The lost Primarchs are not a withheld truth. They are a deliberately constructed absence, and the absence is fertile in a way no truth could ever be. Priestley wanted questions with no answers. Dembski-Bowden enforced a rule that there is not allowed to be an answer. Between them, across 30 years and 50 novels and an entire industry of fan speculation, they have built and defended the single most powerful object in all of Warhammer 40,000. A question that cannot be solved, sitting at the center of a setting that documents everything else. Two empty chairs, guarded on both sides of reality, kept blank on purpose. And the only honest thing left to do is stop trying to pry them open and start admiring the engineering of the lock. We have spent this entire series doing what every fan of the lore does, counting the Primarchs, finding the two gaps, and trying to fill them with theories about null genes and hidden suns and erased loyalty. But step all the way back, past the Imperium,
past the Edict of Obliteration, past the fiction itself, and you find the real cover-up. 2 chairs were left empty on purpose, more than 30 years ago, by people who decided that a question with no answer is the most powerful thing you can put in a story. The Imperium guards the gap to protect its god. Games Workshop guards it to protect the mystery. And the rest of us spend our lives trying to fill a space that was built, with great care, to stay empty forever. The lost Primarchs were never lost. They were left blank. And the blank is the whole point.